Some degree of confusion surrounds the fate of that U.S. proposed truce deal for the war in Gaza. The deal, which would be guaranteed by the White House, Egypt, and Qatar, proposes a 60-day-long ceasefire and the release of 28 Israeli hostages, both dead and alive, within the first week. Now, in exchange, Israel would release 1,236 Palestinian prisoners and the remains of 180 dead Palestinians. While Israeli media reported that Benjamin Netanyahu had accepted that deal, Hamas officials later said on Friday that they are currently reviewing it, even though it fails to meet any of its demands. Well, for more on the latest, then, Tahani Mustafa joins us on the program. She is the senior Palestine analyst at the International Crisis Group. Tahani, thank you so very much for joining us today. So, as we heard there, it looks like Hamas is still weighing that U.S.-backed proposal, though it doesn't meet its demands. What do you imagine the major sticking points are?
I think the major sticking points are more the language that the US was trying to sort of smooth over to make more palatable to the Israeli government. And that was something we were hearing even just before this recent potential rejection now coming from Hamas, which is I think the two main sticking points here for the US, at least, were that on the one hand, they were trying to get Hamas to rein in their demands, and on the other, trying to sort of work or smooth the language over in order to get Israel to accept. And what we now ended up happening was that you now have a US brokered proposal that effectively is so ambiguous in its language that it gives Israel the kind of leeway in order to effectively not act in good faith and be able to, what I think, at least from Hamas's understanding, would be to not just rescind on certain protocols that would be agreed upon, but more importantly, be able to break those protocols, as we saw back in November 2023, where there was so much ambiguity in the language that Israel was able to find leeways in what had been assumed was a mutually understood terms of the agreement. And that's exactly what this proposal now does. So it's not so much about demands and timelines, it's really just the ambiguity that is giving Israel the effective leeway in order to break whatever will be agreed upon.
On the Palestinian side, Tahani, you have written quite extensively about how Palestine needs more political unity in order to negotiate with Israel and bring about something that's more realistic and sustainable in terms of peace. What has prevented the different factions, notably, of course, Hamas and Fatah, from reaching more of a consensus thus far?
Well, look, the political factions have reached a consensus. I think the majority of Palestinian factions, including Fatah itself, has reached a consensus as to what is needed in order to bridge those divides, form a united front, engage in constructive negotiations to try and put an end to the suffering in Gaza, as well as Israel's onslaught in the West Bank. The problem, the biggest obstacle here has been Mahmoud Abbas. This was something that even regional mediators were complaining about back in, again, 2023, early 2024, that the PA had effectively isolated itself, that it is relegating negotiations to what is considered to be an international pariah, a non-starter for Israel, for the US, all the while refusing to engage with regional actors, never mind even Palestinian factions, going against the wishes of these factions, and worse yet, really just isolating itself to speaking only to the Americans and Israel's Western backers, the very forces that right now are not just refusing to rein Israel back in, but are giving it the logistical means to continue its onslaught in both territories, the West Bank and Gaza.
Now, speaking of some of the mediators and some of the backing that Israel has seen from the West, I think it's been rather surprising to see how much of a laid-back view, so to speak, some of the Arab nations have taken when it comes to putting pressure either on Israel or on the United States to end the war quicker. Why do you think that has happened the way that it has? Why have they taken seemingly a backseat, or at least made it so that Gaza takes the backseat in terms of the important issues to be addressed?
Well, look, regional states' interests are no longer what they used to be. I think they've become far more focused on their own sort of self-preservation, domestic politics. A lot of these states, Egypt, Jordan, many of these states are already dealing with quite a precarious sort of balance between their own sort of, I guess you could say, the lack of regime legitimacy and popularity, and the growing frustration on the ground and disconnect with their own populations. This was something that was something that was kind of plaguing these countries before the 7th of October. Now we're obviously seeing that far more clearly post 7th of October, where their foreign policies aren't gelling with local sentiment vis-a-vis the war in Gaza at the moment. But in the way of being able to actually leverage any power over Israel here, again, these are not zero-sum relationships. Israel has as much to gain from these states as they have to gain from their relationships, security, economic, and political with Israel. And more importantly, you're talking about states that, one, don't actually have any serious capacity in the way of being able to rein Israel back in the way that, if we were to look to states like the US. But more importantly, these states themselves are so heavily dependent on US assistance, especially when we look at states like Egypt and Jordan. They're, some of the biggest recipients of US aid in the world. So being able to effectively go against what is now, considered to be US interests vis-a-vis their own ally in the region, Israel, would be almost political suicide for these states. They are effectively US satellites here.
And we also don't see the U.S. showing any signs really at all of willing to rein in Israel, aside from some very brief remarks that the U.S. president made when he was on his regional tour of the Middle East. So what do you think is most likely to be a part of a ceasefire deal that ultimately both Israel and Hamas would realistically accept?
Well, I think what we're seeing now, which is on offer, which is a pause, is really the best we can hope for in the way of US brokering. I don't think we can really expect much else from the US at the moment. We're not getting any rhetoric to the effect of, and we're certainly not seeing any action to the effect of. I think the best we can hope for right now is what is being what is being put on offer now, which is a 60-day pause. Whether that actually ends up translating into into an actual pause is something else. I think Hamas have learned that, it's not just a case of then resuming the killing machine after 60 days, but more importantly, I think the brutality with what comes with the resumption of open warfare, since the January ceasefire and the resumption 2 months later, I think Israel's campaign has been more brutal than anything we've seen in the 14 months that preceded it.
Tahani Mustafa of the International Crisis Group, thank you so very much for coming on the show today.
Thank you.